April 8th, 1994. Thursday morning. Your radio was on. The music stopped. The DJ was crying. "Kurt Cobain is dead," he said. "Where were you in that moment? In your car? Drinking coffee in the kitchen? At work?" Everyone who lived through that time, our generation, the 45 to 60 age group, remembers that moment. Time froze. Nirvana was over. Grunge died. MTV mourned for days. But nobody asked the question that matters most. Was it really suicide? Electrician Gary Smith found the body on April 8th, but Kurt had been dead for 3 days. What happened during those 3 days? Why didn't anyone check? And why was Courtney Love in Los Angeles instead of Seattle? 30 years have passed. Our children have grown up, but that question still hangs in the air. Did Kurt Cobain really kill himself? Before we continue, please subscribe to support more documentary content like this. Now, let's uncover the truth. The Last Days, March 1994. Kurt Cobain was alive, struggling, but alive. He had just returned from Rome where something terrible happened. 50 Rohypnol pills, a coma, Courtney Love waiting 45 minutes before calling an ambulance. The world called it an accident. Kurt's diary told a different story, but he came back to Seattle. He was home. Frances Bean, his daughter, was 20 months old, just learning to walk, just starting to talk. Kurt held her in late March and whispered, "I'll stay clean for you." He made rehab plans. He scheduled family therapy sessions. There was hope. 3 weeks later, he was dead. What changed? That's the question that haunts private investigator Tom Grant to this day. Because Courtney Love hired him on April 3rd NIST, 2 days before Kurt died. Her instructions were simple. Find my husband. He's missing, but here's what doesn't make sense. Kurt wasn't missing. He was home, in the greenhouse above the garage, and the amount of heroin found in his body, 1.52 milligrams, was enough to kill 3 people. Medical examiners who reviewed the autopsy report said that dose would cause immediate incapacitation. Within seconds, Kurt would have lost motor function. Within a minute, he would have been unconscious. Within minutes, he would have been dead. The question nobody wanted to ask in 1994. The question that got buried under grief and grunge nostalgia. The question that Tom Grant has been screaming for 30 years. Can a man with that much heroin in his system pull a trigger? Can he aim a shotgun? Can he position it at the exact angle needed? Can he do all of this within the seconds before unconsciousness takes him? The Seattle Police Department said yes. They closed the case within days. Suicide, open and shut. But Tom Grant saw something they didn't, or something they chose to ignore. He saw a crime scene that had been processed like a suicide before any real investigation happened. He saw evidence that was never collected. He saw questions that were never asked. And most importantly, he saw a timeline that made no sense. Because if Kurt died on April 5th, and Courtney hired Tom Grant on April 3rd saying Kurt was missing, then Courtney's timeline was wrong. Kurt couldn't have been missing on April 3rd and dead on April 5th. If he was in the greenhouse the whole time, someone was lying. And Tom Grant wanted to know who. The detective's discovery. Tom Grant arrived in Seattle on April 3rd, 1994. Courtney Love was in Los Angeles, not Seattle. That detail alone seems strange. Why wasn't she in Seattle looking for her missing husband? Why hire a private detective from another city? Grant went to the Cobain residence on Lake Washington Boulevard. The house was quiet, empty. The air had that particular stillness that comes when a place has been abandoned, when life has stopped moving through its rooms. He searched the main house, nothing. The garage, nothing. And then he noticed the greenhouse above the garage, locked from the outside. Not from the inside, from the outside. That detail would become crucial later. But on April 3rd, Grant didn't enter the greenhouse. He had no reason to suspect Kurt was there, dead, with a shotgun. For 2 more days, Kurt Cobain's body lay in that greenhouse while the world searched for him, while Courtney made phone calls, while Tom Grant followed false leads, and while Frances Bean played downstairs, unaware her father was 30 feet away, gone forever. The greenhouse was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, glass walls on 3 sides, filled with plants and art supplies. Kurt used it as a refuge, a place to think, to write, to escape. Now it was his tomb. Inside, according to later police reports, Kurt's body was positioned sitting against the wall, the shotgun between his legs, pointing up toward his head. There was blood on the wall behind him. There were 3 syringes on the floor nearby, one with heroin residue, 2 that appeared unused. There was a cigar box with drug paraphernalia, and there was a pen and paper, the suicide note, propped up so it would be easily visible. Everything was too neat. That's what struck Tom Grant when he finally saw the crime scene photos. For a violent death, everything was remarkably organized. The drug kit was neatly arranged. The note was carefully positioned. Even Kurt's body, according to Grant, seemed staged rather than natural. It looked like a scene someone had set up to be discovered in a specific way. On April 8th, electrician Gary Smith arrived to install security lighting. He knocked on the door. No answer. He walked around the property. He noticed the greenhouse. He looked through the window, and he saw what nobody wanted to see. Kurt Cobain's body, a shotgun, blood. He called 911. The world found out hours later. But here's the question Tom Grant started asking immediately. Why did Gary Smith look in the greenhouse? What made him check, and why didn't anyone check sooner? Courtney Love knew Kurt was at the house. She had called the property multiple times. She had sent people to check, but nobody looked in the greenhouse. For 3 days, Tom Grant found that suspicious. Very suspicious, because the greenhouse had glass walls. You could see inside from certain angles. If people had really been searching for Kurt, if they had really walked around the property looking, someone would have seen him, unless they were told not to look, unless they already knew what they would find if they did. The evidence that doesn't add up. When Tom Grant finally examined the death scene through police photos and reports, since he wasn't allowed direct access, he noticed several things that didn't fit the suicide narrative. First, the shotgun. The position of the weapon, the angle of the wound, the placement of Kurt's hands, all suggested something impossible. To fire a shotgun of that length, with that barrel positioned at that angle, while holding it with both hands, was biomechanically extremely difficult, if not impossible, for someone of Kurt's size and arm length. Grant consulted with weapons experts. They agreed the angle was wrong. The shotgun used was a Remington Model 11, 20 gauge. It's a long weapon. The barrel extends significantly, and reaching the trigger, while keeping the barrel positioned upward at face level, requires arm extension that exceeds most people's reach, especially someone as slight as Kurt. Forensic firearms experts who reviewed the case later noted that suicide by shotgun typically involves the gun being placed in the mouth or under the chin, positions that are easier to maintain while reaching the trigger. The angle found in Kurt's case was unusual. The shot entered from the side, traveling through the head. This position would have required Kurt to hold the heavy shotgun extended at an awkward angle while reaching back to pull the trigger. Possible, maybe. Likely. Experts said no. Second, the heroin. The amount found in Kurt's bloodstream was massive, 3 times the lethal dose. Medical experts Grant consulted said the same thing. A person with that much heroin would be incapacitated within seconds, unconscious within a minute, likely dead within minutes. The idea that Kurt injected himself with that amount, put away the injection kit neatly, picked up a shotgun, positioned it correctly, and pulled the trigger, all within seconds, seemed impossible. Pharmacologists explained that even with tolerance, and Kurt did have significant heroin tolerance from chronic use, this amount would overwhelm the system immediately. The body simply can't process that much opioid without shutting down. Motor functions would fail first. The ability to grip, to aim, to coordinate complex movements like positioning and firing a shotgun, all would disappear within moments of injection. Yet somehow, according to the official story, Kurt managed all of this before collapsing. But Seattle police disagreed. They said it was possible. They said addicts build tolerance. They said case closed. They never consulted independent medical experts. They never brought in pharmacologists to verify their assumptions. They simply decided it was possible and moved on. Third, the suicide note. This is where things get truly strange. The note found at the scene was written to Kurt's fans, to the music world, about his decision to leave the industry. Most of it sounded like a retirement letter, not a suicide note. Kurt wrote about losing his passion for music, about feeling like a fraud, about wanting to leave the spotlight. These are sentiments he'd expressed before in interviews and in his journal. Until the last 4 lines. Those lines were different, more desperate, more final, clearly about death. It's better to burn out than to fade away. A quote from a Neil Young song that took on sinister meaning in this context. And according to handwriting analysts, Tom Grant hired, those last 4 lines appeared to be written by a different hand. The pen pressure was different. The slant was different. The letter formation was different. Someone, Grant believed, had added those lines to make a retirement letter look like a suicide note. But who? Grant hired 4 different handwriting experts over the years. 3 of the 4 concluded the last lines were inconsistent with the rest of the note. They couldn't definitively say it was a different person. Nicene handwriting analysis isn't perfect, but they said the differences were significant enough to warrant further investigation. The 4th expert disagreed, saying the differences could be explained by emotional state, by the act of writing while intoxicated, by natural variation. But 3 out of 4 experts finding problems should have been enough for Seattle police to take a second look. It wasn't. The Seattle Police Department refused to conduct handwriting analysis. They refused to reopen the investigation, and when Tom Grant went public with his suspicions, they called him a conspiracy theorist. They said he was exploiting a tragedy for attention. They said he was disrespecting Kurt's memory and causing pain to Kurt's family. But Grant didn't stop, because he'd seen too much that didn't fit, too many pieces that didn't belong in a simple suicide story. The FBI files and the wall of silence. Between 1994 and 2006, something remarkable happened. The FBI received complaint after complaint about Kurt Cobain's death investigation, 64 official complaints to be exact, all saying the same thing. This wasn't suicide. Reinvestigate. The complaints came from forensic experts, from handwriting analysts, from concerned citizens, from people who knew Kurt personally, from people who studied the case independently and found the same inconsistencies Tom Grant found, 64 complaints. And the FBI's response? Nothing. 0 investigations, 0 follow-ups. The files were sealed. The evidence was locked away. The Seattle Police Department declared the case closed and refused to reopen it despite mounting pressure. But why? Kurt Cobain wasn't just any person. He was one of the most famous people in the world in 1994. His death changed history. The end of grunge, the collapse of alternative music's mainstream moment, the loss of a generation's voice. If there were legitimate questions about his death, if there was evidence suggesting something other than suicide, why wouldn't authorities investigate? Tom Grant has a theory, a dark theory. He believes Courtney Love was involved, not necessarily as the person who pulled a trigger. Grant has never claimed she was physically present, but as someone who knew, who arranged, who orchestrated, and he believes the Seattle Police Department, for reasons unknown, decided to protect her. Is he right? That's the question that has consumed 3 decades of his life. In 2019, the FBI finally released some files related to the Cobain case. The public was shocked. 64 complaints, detailed forensic concerns, expert opinions, all ignored. But even with this revelation, nothing changed. The case remained closed. Seattle police stood by their original conclusion, and Tom Grant continued his lonely crusade for truth. Now an old man, still carrying the same evidence he carried in 1994, still asking the same question, why won't anyone listen? The Courtney Love question. This is the most controversial part of the story, the part that divides people into believers and skeptics. Tom Grant believes Courtney Love was involved in Kurt's death. His reasoning is based on several factors: timing, behavior, and motive. The timing is suspicious. Courtney hired Grant on April 3rd saying Kurt was missing, but multiple witnesses and phone records show Courtney knew Kurt was at the Seattle house. She had called there. She had sent friends to check. Why hire a detective to find someone when you know where they are? Unless you're creating an alibi. The behavior is suspicious. When Kurt's body was found, Courtney's reaction seemed to Grant performed rather than genuine. She read from a script at a public vigil. She immediately began controlling the narrative: suicide, depression, inevitability. She gave interviews within days, composed and media-ready. Grant found this behavior inconsistent with a devastated widow. The motive is the darkest part. Kurt and Courtney's marriage was falling apart by early 1994. There were police reports of domestic violence. There were rumors Kurt wanted a divorce, and there was one very significant financial issue. Kurt was worth approximately $30 million, and if they divorced, Courtney would get a fraction of that under their prenuptial agreement. But if Kurt died while they were still married, Courtney would inherit everything and control Kurt's estate and music catalog. Tom Grant is careful to say he has no direct evidence Courtney pulled a trigger. He's not accusing her of murder in the legal sense. What he's saying is this: the evidence suggests Kurt didn't kill himself, and Courtney's behavior before and after his death suggests she had knowledge of what was going to happen. But here's the problem. Even if Grant is right, even if there was foul play, proving it 30 years later is nearly impossible. The crime scene was compromised immediately. The Seattle police didn't treat it as a potential homicide, so they didn't preserve evidence properly. Key pieces of physical evidence were lost or destroyed. Witnesses have died, memories have faded, and Courtney Love has never been formally questioned under oath about the inconsistencies in her statements. The result is a frustrating stalemate. Suspicious evidence with no legal recourse. The three-day mystery. Let's return to the timeline, because this is where the story becomes most disturbing. Kurt Cobain died on April 5, 1994. The medical examiner determined this based on decomposition and other factors, but his body wasn't discovered until April 8. 3 days. During those 3 days, several people came to the house. Courtney called the house multiple times. We know this from phone records. She claims she was trying to reach Kurt. But if she was trying to reach him, why didn't she send someone to physically check on him? She did send someone, actually. A friend went to the house on April 6. This friend checked the main house, checked the garage, but didn't check the greenhouse. Why not? Who told this friend not to check the greenhouse? Or did someone tell this friend that Kurt wasn't in the greenhouse, when in fact he was already dead there? On April 7th, another person visited the property. Again, main house checked, greenhouse ignored. It's as if everyone knew not to look in the one place where Kurt actually was. Then on April 8th, Gary Smith, the electrician, arrives. He's there to install security lighting. That's a job Courtney had arranged before Kurt's death. Gary Smith had no emotional connection to the situation. He was just there to do a job. And perhaps because he had no reason not to look, he looked in the greenhouse, and he found Kurt. Tom Grant asks a simple question. In 3 days, with multiple people searching for Kurt, how did everyone miss the greenhouse? Unless they weren't really searching. Unless they already knew. Unless someone was buying time. Time for what? That's the question Grant can't answer. But he suspects it was time to establish alibis. Time to remove evidence. Time to ensure the narrative was controlled before the truth came out. The Francis factor. There's a human dimension to this story that often gets lost in the conspiracy theories and forensic debates. Frances Bean Cobain was 20 months old when her father died. She has no memory of him. Everything she knows about Kurt comes from other people, from videos, from photos, from music. As she grew up, Frances was surrounded by the suicide narrative. Kurt killed himself. He was depressed. He couldn't handle fame. He abandoned you. But as Frances became an adult, she started asking her own questions. In interviews, she's been careful not to take sides in the suicide versus murder debate. She said she doesn't know what happened. She wasn't there. But she's also said something profound. She's forgiven her father either way. If he killed himself, she understands he was sick. If something else happened, she understands he was a victim. What Frances represents is the real tragedy beneath all the theories and investigations. A daughter who never knew her father, a father who, whether by choice or by force, left his daughter behind. In March 1994, Kurt held Frances and promised to stay clean for her. He meant it. Everyone who was there says he meant it. Tom Grant saw the rehab plans, saw the family therapy appointments, saw the evidence of a man trying to get better. So what happened between late March and April 5th? What changed? Did Kurt have a sudden breakdown, a moment of despair so overwhelming that he forgot his promise to Frances, or did someone make a decision for him? This question matters not just for solving a mystery, but for understanding what kind of world allowed this to happen. Because whether Kurt killed himself or was killed, the result is the same: a father and daughter were separated forever, and no amount of investigation or truth-seeking will bring him back. The Seattle Police Department's silence. One of the most frustrating aspects of this case is the Seattle Police Department's refusal to engage with legitimate questions. Tom Grant has repeatedly asked them to reopen the investigation. He's presented new evidence. He's brought in expert witnesses. He's filed official requests. The answer is always the same: case closed. But why such stubbornness? In other high-profile cases, when new evidence or serious questions emerge, police departments often review their conclusions. They might not change their ruling, but they at least examine the concerns. Seattle police have refused even this basic step with Kurt Cobain's case. Some people believe it's simple bureaucratic pride nest. Admitting they might have been wrong in 1994 would be embarrassing. Others believe something darker, that Seattle police know there are problems with their conclusion, but have institutional reasons to maintain it. Perhaps they compromised the crime scene so badly that reopening the case would expose incompetence. Perhaps there are legal liabilities if it turns out they wrongly closed a murder investigation, or perhaps, as Tom Grant suspects, there are people within the department who have personal or political reasons to protect Courtney Love and maintain the suicide narrative. We may never know the truth of what motivates Seattle police. What we do know is this: their silence, their refusal to address legitimate forensic concerns, their stonewalling of FBI complaints. All of this feeds suspicion. If they have nothing to hide, why not allow an independent review? If their original investigation was sound, why not release all the evidence and let experts examine it? The fact that they won't do these things suggests, at minimum, a department more concerned with protecting itself than with seeking truth. The legacy of doubt. 30 years after Kurt Cobain's death, the official story remains suicide, but the doubt remains too, stronger than ever. The doubt isn't coming from fringe conspiracy theorists anymore. It's coming from forensic experts, from investigators, from people who've studied the evidence carefully and found it lacking. It's coming from a generation of people who were there in 1994, who remember the shock and grief, and who now, looking back with adult eyes, see inconsistencies they didn't notice then. The doubt matters because truth matters. Whether Kurt killed himself or was killed, his family, his fans, and history deserve to know what really happened. The doubt also matters because of what it says about justice. If a famous person's death can be mishandled this badly, if questions can be ignored, if evidence can be sealed away and complaints dismissed, what does that say about our system? How many other cases are closed that shouldn't be? The death of Kurt Cobain marked the end of an era for our generation. Grunge died that day. The 90s idealism died that day. For those of us who were there, who heard that DJ crying on the radio, who felt time stop on April 8, 1994, we've lived 30 years with an incomplete story. Maybe it's time for that story to be finished. Maybe it's time for Seattle police to open the files, to allow independent investigation, to answer the questions that Tom Grant and 64 FBI complainants and thousands of concerned people have been asking for 3 decades. Because Kurt Cobain deserves the truth. Frances Bean deserves the truth. And we, the generation that watched it happen, deserve the truth. The enduring questions. As we reach the end of this investigation, let's acknowledge what we know and what we don't. We know Kurt Cobain died on April 5, 1994. We know a shotgun was involved. We know heroin was in his system. These facts aren't disputed. What's disputed is the interpretation of these facts. We know the heroin level was extraordinarily high, high enough that medical experts question whether Kurt could have functioned at all, let alone operated a firearm. We know the shotgun angle was unusual, one unusual enough that weapons experts question whether it was physically possible for Kurt to fire it that way. We know the suicide note's last 4 lines look different from the rest, but different enough that handwriting experts question whether the same person wrote all of it. We know Seattle police closed the case quickly, one enough that forensic experts question whether proper investigation was done. We know the FBI received 64 complaints, one enough complaints that legal experts question why no action was taken. And we know Courtney Love's behavior before and after Kurt's death raised questions, one enough questions that even people who believe Kurt killed himself admit her actions were strange. These knowns don't prove murder, but they absolutely justify reopening the investigation. They justify independent review. They justify at minimum releasing all evidence for public and expert scrutiny. The fact that none of this has happened in 30 years is the biggest mystery of all. Because in America, in a system supposedly built on justice and truth, a case this important with questions this serious should never have been buried this deeply. Tom Grant is now an elderly man. He spent 30 years on this case, much of it alone, much of it mocked, but he hasn't stopped. He hasn't given up. He still believes justice is possible, and maybe he's right. Maybe one day someone in Seattle police will have the courage to say, let's look at this again. Maybe one day someone with authority will say, the questions are legitimate, the evidence deserves review. Maybe one day the truth will come out. The bigger meaning, but whether the case is ever solved or not, Kurt Cobain's death teaches us something crucial about our society. It teaches us that fame doesn't protect you from tragedy. It teaches us that wealth doesn't buy you peace. It teaches us that talent doesn't save you from pain. Kurt had everything the world says you should want: success, money, fans, artistic achievement. And yet, whether by his own hand or someone else's, he died at 27, leaving behind a baby daughter and a legacy of questions. This matters not just for Kurt's story, but for everyone struggling with mental health, with addiction, with chronic pain. Kurt's struggles were real. His pain was real. Whether he died by suicide or was murdered, the suffering that led to that moment was genuine. And we as a society failed him. We failed to help him with his chronic stomach pain that doctors couldn't diagnose for years. We failed to address his addiction with real treatment instead of judgment. We failed to protect him from the pressures of fame that clearly destroyed him mentally. And if Tom Grant is right, we failed to investigate his death properly, allowing whoever might be responsible to go free. These failures echo across 30 years. They echo every time another artist dies young. They echo every time another person with chronic pain turns to dangerous drugs because legitimate medicine has failed them. They echo every time police close a case without proper investigation. Kurt Cobain's death isn't just a mystery to solve, it's a mirror showing us our collective failures. And until we look in that mirror honestly, until we learn from those failures, we'll keep losing people who could have been saved. The call to action. If you or someone you know is struggling with chronic pain, with addiction, with suicidal thoughts, please reach out. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24 hours at 1-800-273-8255. Kurt Cobain didn't get the help he needed, whether because he couldn't find it, wouldn't accept it, or wasn't allowed to receive it. But help exists now, resources exist now, and maybe, just maybe, by understanding what happened to Kurt, we can prevent it from happening to someone else. Share this story. Talk about it. Demand that cases like this be investigated properly. Demand that mental health be treated seriously. Demand that chronic pain sufferers have access to legitimate medical care, not just dangerous alternatives. Kurt's death can't be undone, but its legacy can be one of change, of awareness, of people being saved who otherwise would have been lost. That would be the best way to honor him, not by solving the mystery of how he died, but by ensuring others don't die the same way. 30 years ago, a DJ cried on the radio and announced Kurt Cobain was dead. We've been living with that announcement ever since. Maybe it's time we finally got the full story of what it really meant. The truth is still out there, and some of us won't stop looking until we find it.